Hi, so today I'm going to be presenting on the Greek genocide, which took place from 1914 to 1922. So just a little bit of background. Since the Ottoman Empire fell apart, there was this goal of preserving their power under the rule of the Turkish elite. And this led to this kind of radical nationalism that had an undercurrent of extremely racial political thought. And this led to the creation of the Turkish superstate, which was based kind of on the idea of having another Ottoman Empire type state. So there were the Arabs, the Kurds, and the Armenians were the largest minorities in Turkey, but they weren't the only ones. There were also Greeks, Assyrians, and other smaller groups, and I'm going to be focusing on the Greeks. And so the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, which was the group in control of Turkey at the time that we'll be talking about, had two faces. To the public, they promoted equality and reform and change to be more inclusive for the minorities, but behind the scenes, they were plotting the destruction of the Turkey's Christian minority groups. And so we'll talk more about the Ten Commandments later, but it was basically the CUP's action plan to exterminate those minorities. So a general overview, the first phase of the genocide began in 1914 when entire Greek communities were deported or expelled from the country. Some were moved to the interior into camps where they ultimately died. And during this first phase, there were also boycottings of Greek businesses, more killings, and a lot of Greek properties were seized. And in the later phases, killings were more systematic, so more massacres were carried out, and basically just more larger volumes of people were being killed. It wasn't so much about the deportations anymore, and these killings and massacres were carried out by the Teşkilat-i Mahsus, not sure if I'm saying that right, also known as the Special Organization. And here we have a map of the killings and massacres that took place in Turkey from 1914 to 1922. Each red cross that you see is a spot where there was a massacre. So as you can see, they mostly took place along the coast, not so much in the interior of the country. So the Ten Commandments, these were, they called them the Ten Commandments because there were 10 points in this document that was leaked to the British intelligence. And it was basically the CUP's action plan on how to exterminate the minority groups in Turkey. And they were talking about the Armenians specifically, but they also applied the same method to their other minority groups. So I put some of the ones that stood out to me on the slide. You can read those. But basically it was just to close off the Armenian and other societies, kill the men under 50, avoid, not so much focused on killing the women and children, but kill the men and attack these groups all at one time so they don't have time to form any kind of defense. And the Teşkilat-i Mahsus, or also called the Special Organization, they were an organization headed by Dr. Bahedin Shakir, and they were a force of 30,000 men that was comprised of active military, retired military, and ex-convicts that the government had released from prison. And their sole job was to carry out these mass deportations and massacres under the order of the CUP. So I have two examples of massacres that occurred, and these are two of probably hundreds of massacres that occurred, and these are not these are two smaller ones, but I chose them because I feel like they're more representative of a lot of ones that took place were like these. And so one happened in Karakavuz, and it was a small town in northwest Turkey. It took place in May of 1920. The village was surrounded by members of the Teşkilat and ransacked. A few villagers managed to escape, and all the rest were killed. And in Kumburgaz, this was a coastal town just outside of Istanbul. This massacre took place in January of 1913. So, a Turkish fleet of 500 soldiers landed at the town and ordered all men over the age of 15 to come down to the shore, and all of the 140 men that complied to the order were killed, and the town priest was burned alive at the beach. So I found an article by Andrew Basso called The Theory of Displacement Atrocities. And Basso describes in his paper this class of actions that he calls displacement atrocity crimes. And he defines those crimes as basically a type of killing against a population in which the deaths are caused by indirect means that come from displacing the group. And he describes that these killings are very cost effective for the perpetrator because they require little resources. It makes it harder for the communities to resist against these crimes because they're being pulled out of their communities. They're not in their safe environment. And finally, it gives the perpetrators a chance to hide their crimes from the general public. So in the Greek genocide, we can see that this displacement atrocity is happening in these mass deportations because as the Turkish government is pulling the Greeks out of their homes and communities and forcing them out, they are able to kill them indirectly while they're being deported and on their journey out, and it doesn't cost them much at all. It's hard for them to resist, and they're able to hide it from the general Turkish public. So the other article I found is it talks about the role of ideology in genocides, and it is by Alex Alvarez. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit more about what drives a genocide. So I chose 2 points from his article that he discusses. One is nationalist ideology, and Alvarez explains that this ideology has always idealized the image of sacrifice, and that governments are good at harnessing that image of sacrifice to get people to convince people to go kill other people in the name of what's best for the greater good. So in terms of like the special organization, that squad that was sent out to kill the minority groups, they were kind of in this nationalist ideology of, oh, we're doing this. This is what's best for our country. This is what's best for all of the people. And as I said below, that's probably how they were taught to view what they were doing. And also scapegoating, obviously. So this is, as we've talked about, the belief that a population are responsible for present or past troubles or misfortunes. And Alvarez talked about that the Turkish community might feel that they'll be better able to start fresh without those Christian minority groups, and we can see that the Turkish elite use those minority groups to scapegoat and blame their loss of power over the years on the minorities being present. And finally, in his article, Donald Bloxham, he wrote an entire article on the Armenian and Greek genocide, and he actually talks about how the attacks were maybe less of an organized genocide than an accumulation of acts. And as he states in his article, there was no real a priori blueprint for genocide. And I thought this might be interesting to bring up just because we are in a terrorism and genocide class, yes, but this was another academic's way of viewing what happened. And while maybe I don't necessarily agree with it, I think it is an interesting way to view what happened. And he says that this is because the acts of aggression had started years before. And he's basically just saying that the events snowballed into what we now call a genocide, but they didn't set out for it to be a genocide. Sorry. Um, Finally, my last slide is kind of an aftermath wrap up of what happened. So, from 1914 to 1922, it's estimated that between 289,000 and 750,000 Greeks were killed. Estimates vary. We don't know exactly how many died. Some Greeks were able to make it back to Greece once they were deported, but not all were, obviously, not all made it back. And after World War I, the Treaty of Sèvres called the Turkish government terrorists and tried to punish them for what they had done to the Armenians and the Greeks and those other minority groups. But that caused a war to break out. The Turkish government did not like that at all. It did not go over well. And eventually the Treaty of Lausanne was drafted up, and this treaty, what ultimately is still in place or stayed in place, did not make any reference or mention of Turkey's crimes against these groups and seemingly put an end to any action that was attempted to be taken against this atrocity. And here I have a picture of a newspaper heading at the time that says 700,000 Greeks. So obviously, I mean, that's close to 1 million people that were affected by this genocide. And yeah, so that's all I have for my presentation. I have my references on the next page. Thank you guys.